The lobby of the Ritz-Carlton smelled like white lilies and something expensive I couldn't name. I had been in that building 14 times over the past 6 months' site visits, vendor meetings, one very long conversation with the catering director about whether Harper preferred plated service or family style. I knew the layout the way I know most things I've paid attention to completely. So when I stepped off the elevator at 4:47 in the afternoon and saw my son Bradley standing in front of the ballroom doors with his arms crossed and his jaw set, I knew exactly what I was looking at. Not a misunderstanding, not a last-minute logistical problem. I'd had enough years reading people to know the difference between a man who is confused and a man who has made a decision. I was holding the velvet box in my left hand, small, navy blue, the kind that closes with a soft click. Inside it was the pearl necklace Diane had worn in our wedding photograph, the one taken on the steps of St. Michael's in October of 1978, her hair pinned up, her eyes already laughing at something I'd said. She'd worn those pearls 3 times in her life. Our wedding, Harper's christening, and the last Christmas she was well enough to come downstairs. I had carried them in my jacket pocket every day for the past week. I was going to give them to Harper before she walked down the aisle. Bradley saw me cross the lobby. He didn't move. I want to tell you how we got there. 6 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in early April, Bradley called my direct line at Mitchell Global Supply, not my cell, the office line, which meant he'd thought about the call before making it. He told me Harper had chosen a venue, that the date was set, and that he and Monica were coordinating everything. Then he said, and I remember the exact phrasing because I wrote it down afterward, Harper wants you at the top of the guest list. Dad, she wants you there for all of it. He paused. We just need some help with the numbers. The number he gave me was $1.2 million. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed smoothly, and then very still. I didn't ask him to break it down. Harper was my only grandchild. Diane never got to see her graduate college, never got to meet the man she'd eventually marry. The least I could do was make sure the day was what she deserved. I wrote the check that afternoon. My assistant, Carol, brought me the checkbook. I signed it, put it in an envelope, and told her to have it messengered to Bradley's office before end of business. I didn't ask for an itemized budget. I didn't ask to see the vendor contracts. I trusted him because he was my son, and because for 68 years I had operated on the assumption that trust extended to family until the evidence said otherwise. The first indication arrived 6 weeks after that. On a Wednesday morning in mid-May, Bradley had scheduled a meeting with the primary catering vendor, a firm out of the South End that I had specifically requested after working with them on the company's annual conference 2 years running. I had asked to be included. Bradley had confirmed I would be. When I arrived at the conference room on the 14th floor at 10 o'clock, the meeting had already concluded. Carol told me it had been moved to 9:30. No one had called me. Bradley's assistant, a young man named Evan, said the change had been logged in the shared calendar. I checked the shared calendar. It had been logged at 9:47 the previous evening. I said nothing to Evan. I went back to my office and made a note. 3 weeks after that, Monica emailed me the revised guest list, the final version, she said, before it went to the printer. I opened the attachment and scrolled to the seating chart. Harper had told me, in March, that I would be at the head table. Bradley had confirmed it on the phone in April. In Monica's final chart, the head table had 8 seats. Harper and her fiancé, Bradley and Monica, Monica's parents, and 2 of Harper's college friends. My name was at table 4. When I replied to Monica's email and asked about the change, she wrote back within the hour. She said Harper had wanted to keep the head table intimate. She said Harper had specifically requested it. She said she was sorry if there had been a miscommunication. I read that email twice, then forwarded it to Jonathan without comment. He replied, noted. The third thing happened in late September. Harper called me on a Sunday afternoon, one of our regular calls, the kind we had kept up since she moved to Boston after college, every 2 or 3 weeks, never scheduled, just whenever one of us thought to dial. We talked for 40 minutes. She asked about the company. She asked about the house. She asked whether I had decided what to wear to the rehearsal dinner. She did not mention the head table. She did not mention any change in the seating arrangement. She sounded like herself, warm, unhurried, asking the questions she always asked. When we hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. Harper did not know about the seating change. I was certain of it. The change had not come from her. I called Jonathan that evening. I told him about the vendor meeting, the seating chart, the phone call with Harper. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Richard, I've been watching the account activity for the past 6 weeks. There's something I need to show you, but I want to be sure before I say it. Give me until Friday." I told him to take the time he needed. He said he would call me Friday morning. He called Thursday instead. The evidence started arriving 3 days before the wedding. I called Harper on Thursday morning, her cell, then the hotel room they'd reserved for her. Both went to voicemail. That was unusual but not alarming. She was 26 years old and getting married in 72 hours, and I assumed she was busy in the way that people are busy when they're happy. I called Bradley next. He answered on the second ring, which I noted. He told me the rehearsal had been moved, that the venue had a scheduling conflict, that the original 4 p.m. slot was gone, and that everything was now happening at noon. He said Harper had tried to call me but couldn't reach me. He said it all in the same smooth, rehearsed voice. I thanked him and hung up. Then I called the Ritz-Carlton directly. I asked for the event's concierge. The woman who answered identified herself as Patricia Howe. I'd spoken to Patricia twice before, once about the floral arrangements and once about the rehearsal schedule itself. She had been at that property for 12 years, and she had the particular efficiency of someone who has managed enough wealthy families to understand that the details matter more than the sentiment. I told her I was confirming the rehearsal time. She checked her system. She told me the rehearsal was scheduled for 4 p.m., as originally planned. No changes had been logged. No scheduling conflict on record. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in my office for a long time after that. The velvet box was on the corner of my desk, where I'd placed it that morning. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do in October gray sky. Yellow leaves, everyone moving like they had somewhere to be. I've spent 40 years in that office, or offices like it, and I've learned that the moments that change things rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and you either notice them or you don't. I picked up the phone and called Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan has been Mitchell Global's legal counsel for 20 years. He is 61 years old, careful in the way that good attorneys are careful, and he has the memory of a man who keeps records of everything because he learned early that memory alone is not sufficient. I told him I wanted him to be ready. I didn't specify for what. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've been ready for 3 months. Richard." I didn't ask him what he meant. Not yet. That night, I went home and opened the velvet box on the kitchen table. The pearls were exactly as I remembered, cream white, graduated. The clasp, a small oval of gold that Diane had always said was slightly too fussy, but had never replaced. I looked at them for a while. Then I closed the box and set it on the counter next to my keys. In the morning, I put on the gray suit, the charcoal one, not the navy, because Diane had always said the charcoal made me look like I meant business. I called Martin Osei at 7. Martin has driven for me for 15 years. He pulled up at 7:40. I got in the back seat with the velvet box in my jacket pocket, and we didn't say much on the way to the hotel. Martin knows when to talk and when not to. It's one of the reasons I've kept him that long. We arrived at the Ritz-Carlton at 4:43 in the afternoon. I took the elevator to the ballroom level. The doors opened, and I crossed the lobby, and Bradley was standing in front of the ballroom doors with his arms crossed, and 200 people were somewhere on the other side of that wall, and my granddaughter was about to get married. He looked at me the way people look when they've made a decision and are waiting to see if you'll make them say it out loud. I stopped 4 feet from him. I didn't say anything. I held the velvet box in my left hand and waited, because I have learned over 70 years and 4 decades of running a company that silence makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise say. Bradley said, "Leave, Dad." The lobby of the Ritz-Carlton smelled like white lilies and heated wax from the pillar candles that lined the entrance corridor. I had walked through that lobby 11 times in the past 4-month site visits, vendor meetings, the rehearsal dinner the previous evening, and I knew the way the marble floor caught the light at 6 in the evening, the way the chandeliers threw small prisms across the ceiling when the front doors opened. I had written the check that made all of it possible. $1,200,000 signed on a Tuesday morning in February because Harper was my son's daughter and she was getting married, and I wanted her to have the day she'd always described to her grandmother before her grandmother died. I stood 4 feet from Bradley and held the velvet box and waited. He said it again. "Dad, we're at capacity. Fire marshal's orders." I looked past him into the ballroom. The doors were opened 6 inches enough to see the rows of white chairs, the soft candlelight, the arrangement of pale roses along the aisle that Monica had selected from a florist on Newbury Street. I counted at least 30 empty seats in the first 3 rows alone. I didn't say that. I looked at Bradley and said, "Bradley, I'm Harper's grandfather." He didn't move. He was wearing the charcoal suit I'd seen him order at the fitting in March Italian wool, custom cut, the kind of suit that costs more than most people's monthly rent. He'd put it on my corporate card, and I hadn't said a word about it because I thought it was the kind of thing a father did for his son at a daughter's wedding. His arms were still crossed. His jaw was set. He had the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was determined to see it through. Thomas Reeves was standing 8 steps to my left. I had known Thomas for 22 years. He was the chairman of Northeastern Shipping, one of the first major clients I'd signed after Mitchell Global moved out of the warehouse on Forsyth Street and into an actual office with actual employees. We had eaten dinner together at least 40 times over those 2 decades, client dinners, charity events, the annual maritime conference in Portland, where we always ended up at the same table. His wife, Eleanor, was beside him in a pale blue dress, holding a small clutch and watching the corridor. Thomas had seen me the moment I stepped off the elevator. He'd nodded. I nodded back. That was the last comfortable moment of the evening. He was close enough to hear everything. Bradley said, "I'm sorry, Dad. It's not my call." "Whose call is it?" He didn't answer. He looked over his shoulder toward the interior of the ballroom, and then Monica appeared in the gap between the doors. She was wearing a deep burgundy gown I didn't recognize, and the diamond necklace I did. I had purchased that necklace in October as a wedding gift, a gesture toward the family we were supposed to be building together. It was a single strand of oval-cut diamonds, simple and clean, the kind Diane would have appreciated. When I had given it to her, Monica had held the box for a moment and said she wanted to save it for the wedding, that it deserved the right occasion. I had told her that was exactly the right instinct. She had it clasped around her throat now, and she was smiling in the way that people smile when they are not smiling. She stepped through the doors and let them close behind her. "Richard," she said. Not Dad, not even Mr. Calloway, Richard. In 8 years of knowing this woman, she had called me Dad 47 times. I am not exaggerating when I say I counted, because that is the kind of thing a man notices when he is trying to understand how a family works. She had called me Dad at Thanksgiving, and at Christmas, and at the anniversary dinner I hosted for Bradley's 40th birthday. She had called me Dad when she asked me to co-sign the mortgage on their house in Chestnut Hill. She had called me Dad at the hospital when Harper was born, when I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours, and then held my granddaughter for the first time, and felt the weight of her in my arms, and thought about Diane, and about how much she would have loved this. Monica said, "Harper made her choice. Richard. She said if you walk through those doors, she walks out of her own wedding." The lobby was very quiet. There was music coming through the ballroom doors, a string quartet, something I recognized but couldn't name, and the sound of 200 people talking at a low murmur, the way people talk when they're waiting for something to begin. 2 of the hotel staff were stationed near the elevator bank, a young woman in a black uniform whose name tag said Priya, and an older man I'd seen at the concierge desk earlier in the week, Patricia Howe. The head concierge was standing at the edge of the corridor. She had been the one to walk me through the final vendor confirmations on Thursday. She was looking at the floor now. I looked at Monica, and I did not say anything for 4 seconds. She held my gaze. She was very good at holding a gaze. That was something I'd noticed about her early, on the way she could look at you and make you feel that the conversation was already over and she had already won it. Bradley had married a woman who was better at negotiation than he was. Under different circumstances, I might have respected that. I said, "Monica, Harper doesn't know I'm here." "She knows." "She doesn't." Monica's chin lifted slightly. It was a small movement, the kind that happens when someone has been caught in a lie they haven't told yet. I thought about what I knew of the day's schedule. Harper had been in the bridal suite since 2 o'clock. With her bridesmaids and the photographer, Monica had been coordinating everything from the corridor. Harper's phone had gone to voicemail all morning. I had assumed she was busy in the way that brides are busy. Now I understood that busy and unreachable were not the same thing. She said, "This isn't the time or place. Richard, we have guests inside." "You have 200 guests inside," I said, "and 30 empty chairs." Bradley said, "Dad." "It's fine, son." I said it quietly. I said it the way I had learned to say things over 40 years of running a company, not as surrender, not as defeat, but as the kind of statement that closes a door and opens another one. I had used that tone in boardrooms and in courtrooms, and once in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning when a doctor told me something I didn't want to hear, and I had to decide in that moment whether I was going to fall apart or hold the thing together. I had always held the thing together. Diane used to say that was my greatest gift and my greatest flaw, and she was right on both counts. I looked at Bradley one more time. He was still standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the Italian wool suit I had paid for, and he was looking at me with something I couldn't quite name, not guilt, not satisfaction, something between the two, something that had been building for a long time and had finally found its moment. I turned around. I walked back across the marble lobby, past the pillar candles, past Priya and the concierge desk and the elevator bank. Thomas Reeves was still standing where he had been. As I passed him, I saw him start to step forward a half movement, the kind a man makes when he has decided to say something and then immediately reconsiders. Eleanor's hand found his arm. Not a grab, just a touch. The lightest possible contact, the kind that carries a full sentence in it. Thomas stopped. He looked at me for one more second, then looked away, not sharply, not as a flinch, but the slow redirect of a man who has decided that whatever he might say would cost more than it would help. Eleanor said nothing. Thomas said nothing. They both looked toward the ballroom doors. That was the moment. Not Monica's voice, not Bradley's crossed arms, not the 30 empty chairs I could see through the gap in the ballroom doors. It was Thomas Reeves turning away from me in the lobby of the hotel I had paid for, at the wedding of my granddaughter, after a man I had raised told me to leave. 22 years, 40 dinners, the Maritime Conference in Portland every September. I pressed the elevator button and waited. The doors opened. I rode down to the lobby level and walked through the front entrance and out into the evening air. It was 61 degrees. I remember that specifically because I had checked the weather that morning when I was getting dressed, and I had noted that it would be a good evening for a wedding. Martin was standing beside the car. He had been my driver for 15 years, and in 15 years he had developed the particular skill of knowing when to speak and when not to. He looked at me through the glass as I came down the steps. He opened the rear door without being asked. I got in. He closed the door and walked around to the driver's side and sat down and started the engine. We did not move for a moment. The hotel entrance was lit behind us. I could see the valets moving between cars, the light from the lobby falling across the stone steps. Somewhere on the 4th floor, 200 people were sitting in white chairs waiting for my granddaughter to walk down an aisle lined with pale roses that I had paid for, in a room I had paid for, at a hotel I had paid for. Martin put the car in drive. We had gone perhaps half a block when my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. It was a text from Patricia Howe, the event's concierge, the woman who had managed every vendor confirmation for the past 6 months, the woman who had been standing at the edge of the corridor when Monica told me to leave. The text said only Mr. Calloway. Please call when you are able. I called her. She answered on the first ring. She said, Mr. Calloway, I want you to know that I witnessed what happened this evening. I don't think it's my place to comment on family matters. She paused. But I do want to remind you that the event contract for this evening, all vendor agreements, the catering terms, the room hold, the floral and audio arrangements is in your name, not Mr. Bradley Calloway's, yours. That has been the case since the deposit was signed in February. Another pause. If you wish to make any changes to the service arrangements for the remainder of the evening, you have the contractual authority to do so. I would execute those changes immediately and without question. I sat with that for a moment. Martin kept driving. The streetlights moved overhead. I said, Patricia, I want you to do one thing. She said, of course. I said, at the end of the evening, when the event closes out, make sure the final billing summary goes to my office, not to Bradley's. Every line item, every vendor invoice, I want it documented that this evening was paid for, start to finish, by Richard Calloway. I paused. And I'd like you to send that summary to Bradley's email address as well, as a courtesy. There was a brief silence. Then Patricia said, very quietly, I'll see to it personally. I thanked her and ended the call. Martin had not turned around. He kept his eyes on the road, the way he always did. I put the phone back in my jacket pocket beside the velvet box. We drove for 4 minutes before I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone again. Martin kept his eyes on the road. That was what I had always valued about him 15 years, and he had never once turned around to ask me if I was all right. He knew the difference between silence that needed breaking and silence that needed protecting. Tonight was the second kind. Tremont Street unrolled in front of us the way it always did the pharmacy on the corner with the green awning, the parking structure on the left where I used to leave my car during the years I worked downtown before I could afford a driver, the old brick building on the right that had been a textile warehouse in the 1940s and was now condominiums selling for $800,000 a unit. I had walked past that building for the first time in 1979 carrying a briefcase I had bought secondhand from a shop on Washington Street. I had looked up at it then and thought someday. I did not know what I meant by that exactly. I just knew I meant something. I counted the buildings the way I always counted things when I needed to think clearly. The pharmacy, the parking structure, the textile building, the insurance office that had been there since at least 1995, the corner deli that changed owners every 3 years but always kept the same green and white awning as if the awning itself were the business. I had driven this route approximately 400 times. I knew every building by its position and its light, the way a sailor knows water by its color. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the velvet box. I did not open it. I held it in both hands the way you hold something that used to belong to someone else, something you have been trusted with. The velvet was worn smooth on one corner, the corner I always touched first. Diane had worn those pearls on our wedding day, and on the day Mitchell Global Supply signed its first contract worth more than $1 million, and on the day Bradley was born, and on the day Bradley's daughter was born. She had been wearing them the last time she left the house under her own power. The hospice nurse had unclasped them for her at the end and put them in my hand and said, very quietly, that Mrs. Calloway had asked her to make sure I kept them safe. I had kept them safe for 11 years. I had brought them tonight because Harper was the last piece of Diane I could see clearly in the world, and I had wanted Diane to be there for it. That was all. That was the whole reason. I put the box back in my pocket. Martin made the turn onto Commonwealth without signaling, the way he always did on that particular turn because he knew the timing of the light, and there was never anyone behind us at this hour. I watched the streetlights pass overhead. I counted 6 of them before I understood, completely and without any remaining doubt, what had actually happened tonight. 6 months ago, in my study on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Bradley had sat across from me at the desk where I have signed every significant document of my adult life. He had the wedding budget breakdown in a folder, itemized, color-coded, the way Monica organized everything, every column aligned, every number rounded to the nearest dollar. He had gone through it line by line. Catering, flowers, the string quartet for the ceremony, the DJ for the reception, the suite for Harper and her husband on the wedding night, the honeymoon deposit, and then, at the end, he had closed the folder and looked at me and said, "Harper wants you at the head table." Dad, she's been very clear about that. She wants Grandpa at the head table. I had written the check for $1,200,000 that same afternoon. I had not asked for anything in return. He was my son. She was my granddaughter. That was the entire calculation. Now, on Tremont Street, 4 minutes after being told to leave my granddaughter's wedding by the son I had built everything for, I understood that the sentence about the head table had not been an expression of Harper's wishes. It had been a mechanism. You tell a man his granddaughter wants him at the head table, and the man writes the check. The check was the point. The head table was never the point. Harper may not have known any of this. That thought landed differently from all the others, and I let it sit without pushing it away. I took out my phone. The time was 7:47 in the evening. I found Jonathan Pierce's number. I had known Jonathan for 20 years longer than Bradley had worked at the company, longer than Monica had been in our family, longer than Harper had been alive. He had been at my wife's funeral. He had drafted the original operating agreement for Mitchell Global in 1989, sitting at my kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon while Diane made coffee and asked him questions about the legal process that were sharper than anything I had thought to ask. He had laughed and said she should have gone to law school. She had said she still might. I pressed call. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "Jonathan." He said, "Richard." I said, "Trigger the winter protocol." There was a silence. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Not the silence of a man who was surprised. The silence of a man who had been waiting to hear a specific sentence and was taking a single breath before responding to it. He said, "I've had the documents ready since September. Richard, I was waiting for your call." I looked out the window. We were passing the insurance office. The lights were off inside, the way they always were at this hour, but the sign was lit from below, one of those signs that stays on all night because someone decided years ago that it should, and no one has thought to change the decision since. September, 3 months ago. I had called Jonathan in September after a board meeting at which Bradley had made 3 procedural motions in sequence motions that, individually, were unremarkable, but that together formed a pattern I recognized. I had been in enough negotiations to know what it looked like when someone was repositioning. I had called Jonathan that evening and said, "I want you to prepare something. I want a set of documents that can be executed on short notice." I did not tell him what I suspected. I did not need to. Jonathan had been watching the company for 20 years. He understood what I was asking and why. He said, "Now, here is what happens next. Tonight, I file the authorization to revoke Bradley's signatory authority on all company accounts, and I submit the freeze request to First Federal with the full supporting documentation. The filing goes in tonight. The bank will not execute until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. When they open, they need the paperwork in hand before they can act, and they'll verify everything against the account records before they move. His corporate credit cards will be suspended at the same time. His access credentials to the financial systems I can deactivate before the markets open tomorrow. That part doesn't require the bank." I said, "The properties." He said, "The 2 properties he listed under the company umbrella in March. I flagged those in September as well. There is a question about the filing structure that I want to walk you through before we act on those, because there are 2 ways to proceed, and one of them is cleaner than the other. But the accounts and the access, those we can lock tonight." I said, "Do it." He said, "Consider it done. I'll send confirmation to your personal email by 10 o'clock. I said, "Thank you, Jonathan." He said, "Richard." A pause. "I'm sorry it came to this." I said, "So am I." I ended the call and put the phone back in my pocket. Martin was pulling onto my street. The elms along the block were bare. It was November, and they had been bare for 3 weeks. The branches making the same pattern against the sky they made every year, the pattern I had memorized without meaning to over the course of 34 years of living on this street. I had planted 2 of those elms myself, the 2 in front of my house, in the spring of 1991. Bradley had been 11 years old and had helped me dig the holes. He had complained about the work and then been proud of the trees for years afterward, pointing them out to his friends when they came over. "Those are ours," he used to say. "My dad and I planted those." Martin stopped the car at the curb. He put it in park and sat with his hands on the wheel. I did not move immediately. I sat for 30 seconds. I counted them, the way I count things, and I looked at the front of my house. The light above the door was on. I leave it on whenever I go out in the evening. Diane started that habit, and I kept it because the alternative was coming home to a dark house, and I have never been willing to do that. I said, "Thank you, Martin." He nodded once. He did not say anything, and I did not need him to. I got out of the car and walked up the front path and unlocked the door and went inside. The house was quiet the way houses are quiet when they have been empty for several hours, a specific quality of stillness, different from the quiet of a house where someone is simply in another room. I had learned to tell the difference in the first year after Diane died. It had taken me that long. I went to the kitchen. I set the velvet box on the counter that runs along the east wall, where Diane used to put her coffee cup in the morning while she read the paper. She always put it in the same place, slightly to the left of center, so that she could reach it without looking up from whatever she was reading. After she died, I had not been able to put anything in that spot for almost 8 months. Then one morning, I had set my own coffee cup there, and it had felt like something, and I had left it there. And after that, it became the place where I put things that mattered. I put the velvet box there now. I stood in the kitchen for a moment without turning on the overhead light. The light from the street came through the window above the sink, the same light that had come through that window every night for 34 years. I could see the counter and the box and the shape of the kitchen that I knew by memory well enough that I could have moved through it in complete darkness. Jonathan had been ready since September. That meant I had known, at some level, since September. Not known precisely, not known the wedding, not known the 200 people, not known the words my son would use when he put his hand on my arm and told me to leave, but known the shape of it, known that something was coming that would require me to be prepared rather than surprised. I had spent 40 years learning the difference between those 2 states, and I had learned it well enough to act on it even when I could not yet name what I was acting against. I was not surprised tonight. That was the thing. Standing in my kitchen at 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening, I was not surprised. I was ready. Martin pulled away from the Ritz-Carlton at 7:43. I watched the building's entrance recede in the side mirror until the doorman, a young man I didn't recognize, turned back inside and the glass doors closed behind him. Then I looked at my hands, folded in my lap, and I thought about a Chevrolet truck. Not this truck. Not any truck I currently owned. A 1979 Chevy C10 with 140,000 miles on it, a cracked dashboard, and a heater that worked on the driver's side but not the passengers. I bought it for $2,200 in the spring of 1984 from a man named Gerald Hatch, who ran a salvage yard outside of Worcester, Massachusetts. Gerald had a firm handshake and a skeptical eye. And when I told him what I intended to do with the truck, start a freight delivery company, work the regional textile mills, build something, he looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Son, you'd better have a good wife." I told him I did. He said, "Then you'll probably be fine." Diane was 29 that spring. She had a degree in accounting from UMass Amherst and a job at a firm in downtown Worcester that she quit without telling me she was going to quit it. I found out when she showed up at our apartment at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday with a cardboard box of her desk belongings and a yellow legal pad already filled with handwritten columns. She sat down at the kitchen table, opened the legal pad, and said, "You need a bookkeeper. I need a purpose. Stop arguing." I had not said anything yet. She looked up from the pad and added, "The truck needs new rear brake pads. I already called Gerald." The first contract was $4,200. A textile mill on Grafton Street needed a shipment of finished goods moved to a warehouse in Providence, Rhode Island. By Friday morning, I drove the route myself twice to check the timing. Diane sat in the passenger seat the second time, legal pad open on her knees, noting mileage and estimated fuel costs, and the time it took to load at the dock. She was wearing a blue wool coat that was too heavy for April. When we crossed the state line into Rhode Island, she put down her pen and looked out the window for a moment. Then she wrote something in the margin of the legal pad. I asked her what it said. She said, "It says first one." I never asked to see that page again. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where it was until the day she died. By 1991, we had 12 trucks. We had 3 full-time employees besides ourselves, a dispatcher named Carl Briggs, who worked out of a converted garage on Shrewsbury Street, and 2 drivers, both of whom I had personally trained on the routes before I handed them the keys. We had a bank loan of $800,000 that I had signed for personally, with our house on Elmwood Avenue listed as collateral. The loan officer, a man named Douglas Fitch at First Worcester Savings, had looked at me across his desk and said, "Mr. Calloway, you understand what this means. If the company cannot service this debt, you lose the house." I said I understood. He said, "Your wife has reviewed these terms." I said she had. He said, "And she's in agreement." I said she was the one who told me to come in and sign. Diane had not asked questions about the loan. She had read every page of the documents herself, on a Sunday afternoon, at the same kitchen table where she had opened her cardboard box 7 years earlier. When she finished, she put the papers down and said, "Sign it." I said the risk was considerable. She said, "I know what the risk is." I calculated it. Then she got up and made coffee. And that was the end of the conversation. We did not lose the house. By 1993, the loan was paid down by 40%. By 1997, it was gone. I thought about that kitchen table often over the years. It was nothing remarkable oak veneer, 6 chairs, a surface that had been scarred by decades of coffee cups and legal pads, and the edges of file folders. When we moved to the house in Chestnut Hill in 2001, Diane refused to leave it behind. The movers wanted to leave it. It wasn't worth the truck space, they said. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and told them to put it in the truck. It came with us. It was still in our kitchen the night she died. Bradley graduated from Wharton in the spring of 2003. He was 26 years old, and he had a degree that cost more than the Chevy truck, the first year's insurance, and the first contract combined. He had done well there, not spectacularly, but solidly. His professors said he had good instincts for operations. I believed them. I wanted to believe them. I brought him into the company as Deputy Director of Operations in September of that year, and I told him, on his first day, that I was not handing him anything. I was giving him a vantage point. The difference mattered. He nodded and said he understood. Diane had said, "The week before Bradley started, don't give him authority before he's earned it." I told her I wasn't planning to. She looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she believed I was telling myself something I needed to hear, rather than something that was true. I did not ask what she meant. I knew what she meant. I gave Bradley increasing responsibility over the following years anyway, not all at once, but steadily, the way water finds its level. By 2010, he was running the North American Logistics Division. By 2014, he was signing contracts. I used to sign myself. I told myself this was what succession planning looked like. I told myself Diane would have approved. I was not entirely sure either of those things was true. In September of 2018, Diane was diagnosed. In November of 2018, she was gone. The interval between those two events was 51 days, and I spent most of them at the hospital on Longwood Avenue, in a chair beside her bed, holding her hand or reading to her or simply sitting while she slept. The company ran without me during those weeks. Bradley ran it. He did not call unless he had to. I told myself that was the right instinct, that he was protecting me from distraction. I still believe that was partly true. I also believe it was the period during which he began to understand, for the first time, what the company would look like without me in it. The night after her funeral, I went back to the office. It was a Saturday, 11 o'clock in the evening, and the building was empty except for the security desk on the ground floor. I took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked to my office and turned on the light. The wall behind my desk was covered in a logistics map, 47 countries, 211 active partners, freight routes drawn in 3 colors depending on volume. I had started that map in 1999 with 6 routes and a black marker. Diane had added the first international route herself, in red, when we signed the contract with a shipping consortium out of Rotterdam. She had drawn a small star at the origin point. I had never moved the star. I stood in front of that map for a long time. Then I called Bradley. It was late, but he answered. I told him I wanted him in the office on Monday morning, not for any specific purpose, but because I had something I needed to say to him in person. He came in at 8 o'clock. I sat him down across from my desk, the same desk I had bought secondhand from a liquidated law firm in 1994, the same desk Diane had refinished herself one summer because she said the veneer was lifting and it looked unprofessional, and I told him that I wanted him to be ready to take over the company within 5 years, not as a gift, as a responsibility. I told him what I had built and what it had cost and what it required of the person who held it. I told him that Mitchell Global Supply was not a title or a salary or a corner office. It was 40 years of decisions, most of them made at kitchen tables and loading docks and in the cabs of trucks that smelled like diesel and cold coffee. I told him I was trusting him with all of it. He nodded. He said he understood. He said he was grateful. He looked me in the eye when he said it, and his voice did not waver. And I believed him. I believed him completely. I did not know, sitting in my kitchen now, exactly when he had stopped meaning it. I did not know whether he had meant it in that moment and changed later, or whether he had already begun calculating in the back of his mind while his expression stayed steady. What I knew what Jonathan's call had confirmed, what Patricia Howe's careful account of the rehearsal dinner had confirmed, what the 200 people in the Ritz-Carlton ballroom had confirmed without knowing they were confirming anything, was that at some point between that Monday morning in 2018 and tonight, my son had looked at everything I had handed him and decided it was not enough, or decided it was too much to share, or decided that I had lived long enough to be inconvenient. I reached across the kitchen table and picked up the small velvet box that I had set there when I came in. Inside it was Diane's pearl necklace, a single strand, 42 pearls, a gold clasp that I had taken to a jeweler on Newbury Street 3 times over the years to have repaired. I had brought it tonight because Harper had asked me to bring it. She had called me 2 weeks ago and said that she wanted to wear something of her grandmother's at the wedding, and I had said yes before she finished the sentence. The necklace had been in my jacket pocket all evening. I had not had the chance to give it to her. I held the box in both hands for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street, and then the sound faded, and there was nothing. I had given Bradley the truck routes and the client relationships and the bank contacts and the operational systems that Diane and I had spent 20 years refining. I had given him the name Mitchell Global Supply, which meant something in 47 countries because of what we had done before he arrived. I had given him a salary and an office on the 14th floor and a seat at every table that mattered. I had given him time, 5 years of preparation, 5 years of being walked through decisions rather than handed them fully formed. I had given him my name. And tonight, in front of 200 people, in a room that I had paid for, he had put his hand on my arm and told me to leave. I set the velvet box back on the table. I did not close it. I looked at the pearls for a moment. 42 of them, perfectly matched, the gold clasp catching the kitchen light, and I thought about Gerald Hatch's salvage yard and Douglas Fitch's desk, and the red star Diane had drawn on the logistics map, and the yellow legal pad with first 1 written in the margin. 40 years, built from a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked on one side. I had given Bradley everything that those 40 years had produced. He had used it to open a door and show me out. I closed the velvet box. I stood up from the table. I walked to the window and looked out at the street for a moment, at the ordinary Saturday evening quiet of it, and then I turned back to the kitchen and picked up my phone. There were things to do in the morning. Jonathan had already started. The banks would open at 9. The call came at 6:23 in the morning. I was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the neighbors' sprinklers run on their Saturday timer, arcing slow and indifferent over the lawn across the street. The velvet box was still on the counter where I'd left it the night before. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Jonathan's name came up on the screen. I answered on the second ring. Richard. His voice was the voice of a man who had been awake for some time. I need you to hear something before the banks open. I set my coffee down on the counter. Go ahead. There was a pause, not hesitation, but the particular pause of a man organizing what he is about to say so that it lands correctly. Jonathan had been my attorney for 20 years. I recognized the pause. When we began preparing the freeze documentation last night, I had Ellen run a full reconciliation on the operating accounts. Standard protocol before we lock anything. Ellen Marsh had been our internal auditor for 14 years. She did not make errors, and she did not raise flags without cause. She flagged something. I had her run it twice before I called you. The sprinklers across the street finished their cycle and went still. Bradley has been moving money, Jonathan said. Not company expenses, not draws, transfers structured, quarterly, routed through a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The entity was incorporated 11 months ago under a name that doesn't connect to him directly. He paused again. 8 months of transfers. Richard, the total is $3.7 million. I did not say anything. He forged your signature on the distribution authorizations. Each one, quarterly sign-offs that would have gone through your office for review, except that for the past 8 months. Your review copies were being intercepted before they reached your desk. Ellen found the routing discrepancy in the internal logs. The originals are in the filing system. The copies you were supposed to see don't exist. He paused. The first transfer was dated 11 days after Diane's funeral. He modified the internal approval workflow in December of 2018, routed the distribution sign-offs through a secondary queue that he controlled directly. You were not in the office regularly that winter. No one flagged it because the workflow change looked like a routine administrative update. And at the time, people were being careful about what they brought to you. He said that last part quietly. I understood what he meant. People had been protecting me from distraction while I was grieving. Bradley had used that protection as a door. 11 seconds. I counted them without meaning to the same way I used to count the seconds between lightning and thunder when Bradley was small and afraid of storms. Standing at this same window, telling him that counting meant you were safe because you were paying attention. 11 seconds of silence in my kitchen on a Saturday morning, with the coffee going cold on the counter and the velvet box 6 inches from my right hand. Jonathan did not fill the silence. He had learned, over 20 years, that I would speak when I had something to say. If you've ever stood in a room and realized that the thing you were grieving was smaller than the thing you hadn't yet found, leave a like because that's exactly where I was standing. How certain is Ellen? I asked. She's certain enough that I've already sent the documentation to the FBI field office this morning and simultaneously to the corporate fraud division at the U.S. Attorney's office. The wire fraud alone is federal. The forgery compounds it. Another pause. They'll open a preliminary investigation. These things move at their own pace. Could be days before they contact you directly. Could be longer before anything formal happens. But the referral is made. I wanted you to hear it from me first. I looked at the velvet box. The clasp was the same small gold clasp it had always been. Diane had bought the box herself. She'd said the jewelry store's case was too plain for something that would last longer than either of them. She had been right about that, as she had been right about most things. $3.7 million. 8 months. A shell company incorporated 11 months ago, which meant he had been planning this before the wedding, before the venue deposit, before the invitation list and the rehearsal dinner, And the moment he had put his hand on my chest in the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton and told me to leave. He had been planning this while I was writing the check. "Jonathan," I said. "Yes." "You did the right thing." I picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. "One more thing." "Name it." "Don't give him a chance to explain himself to me before the FBI makes contact." I set the cup down again. "If he calls this office, if he calls anyone on our team, I don't want a conversation. I don't want a meeting. I don't want to sit across the table from him and listen to whatever he's prepared." I looked out the window at the empty lawn across the street, the sprinkler heads retracted and still. Whatever he has to say, he can say it to them. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Understood. I'll make sure of it." "Thank you," I said, "for last night, for this morning, for the 20 years before both." "Richard," his voice was careful, "I'm sorry it came to this." "So am I," said, and I meant it not as a performance, not as the kind of thing you say to close a phone call gracefully. I meant it the way you mean something when the meaning of it has had all night to settle into the floor beneath you and you are standing on top of it, feeling the weight. I ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator ran its low, constant hum. Outside, a car passed on the street and was gone. I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand, and then I put it face down on the counter and looked at the velvet box. I opened it. The pearls were the same color they had always been, not white, exactly cream, with something warmer underneath, the way old things hold light differently than new things do. Diane had worn them to every occasion that mattered. She had worn them the day we signed the papers on the first warehouse. She had worn them the day Bradley was born. She had worn them to every Christmas dinner for 31 years. And she had worn them the day the doctor told us what the scan had found, sitting in a chair in a fluorescent office, her hands very still in her lap. I looked at them for a long time. Then I closed the box. I carried it to the cabinet beside the sink, the narrow one with the shallow drawer that Diane had always used for the things she wanted to keep close but not visible. Her good pen, the small photograph from our first apartment, the card Bradley had made her when he was 6, crayon on construction paper, the letters uneven and enormous. I put the velvet box in the drawer. I closed it. There were things in motion now that I had not set in motion alone. Federal investigators, frozen accounts, 40 years of documentation that Jonathan and Ellen had spent the night organizing into a case. There were consequences coming that I had not designed and could not fully control, because that is the nature of the truth. When it finally gets loose, it goes where it needs to go, and it does not ask permission. I had spent 40 years building something real. Bradley had spent 8 months dismantling it from the inside, with my own signature forged on the paperwork. I knew what that meant. I knew what came next. I was ready. Monday morning, I was at my desk by 8. I had slept 4 hours, which was enough. Martin had driven me home from the hotel at just past midnight, and neither of us had said anything for most of the 40 minutes. When he pulled up to the house, he turned off the engine and sat for a moment before getting out to open my door. I told him he didn't need to do that. He did it anyway, the way he had for 15 years. I made coffee. I read the paper. I waited. At 9:02, my phone lit up. Bradley. I set it face down on the desk and let it ring. It rang again at 9:04, then 9:06, then 3 more times in the next 11 minutes, each call a few minutes apart, each one going to voicemail without a message. The 7th call came at 9:13. I watched the screen until it went dark. At 9:15, my phone rang again, but this time it was Ellen Marsh, the account manager at First Federal, who had handled Mitchell Global's banking relationship for 9 years. She said, "Mr. Calloway, I'm calling to confirm that the freeze protocol was executed at 9 o'clock this morning across all designated accounts. All access has been suspended pending the federal hold." I thanked her. She said she was sorry it had come to this. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for and that she had done her job correctly. We hung up. I poured a second cup of coffee and drank it at the window. The yard was still. There was frost on the grass near the stone wall that Diane and I had built the summer Harper was born, the summer Bradley had carried the rocks from the back field because he was 12 and wanted to help and couldn't lift anything heavier than 10 pounds. I remembered that. I remembered thinking, watching him struggle with a stone he could barely move, this boy is going to work hard his whole life. I had believed that for a long time. At 10:30, my phone rang again. It was Jonathan. He said, he just tried to log into the main system. IT locked him out automatically at 10:28. He called the help desk twice. They referred him to legal, per the protocol. I asked if there had been any issues. Jonathan said no. He said, everything is running exactly the way we planned. I said, good. We hung up. At 11 o'clock, I convened the emergency board session I had scheduled the previous Thursday before the wedding, before the ballroom, before any of Saturday night. The 4 independent directors filed into the 14th floor conference room in the order they always filed in Warren Chu first, then Patricia Aldridge, then James Okafor, then Robert Stills, who had been on the Mitchell Global Board since 2007 and who had known Diane personally. None of them had been told the specific reason for the meeting. I had said only that there was a matter requiring immediate board attention and that I needed them present. I set Ellen Marsh's reconciliation report on the table printed, tabbed. 1 copy per director. I gave them 12 minutes to read it. The room was very quiet while they read. Warren Chu turned to the second page and stopped. He read that page twice. Patricia Aldridge reached the summary on page 3 and set the document down and looked at the window. James Okafor did not look up at all until he had finished every page. Robert Stills read it through once, then closed the cover and placed both hands flat on the table and looked at me. I said Bradley's access was suspended at 9 this morning. The federal referral was made Saturday night. I wanted this board to hear the facts from me directly, in this room, before anything else. I did not say anything more than that. I did not need to. The numbers were on the page. The pattern was on the page. 40 years of what Mitchell Global Supply had been built to be was on the page, and so was what Bradley had done to it. Robert Stills said, very quietly, "Richard, I'm sorry." The other 3 said nothing. That was answer enough. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be accurate about that. I felt something closer to the way you feel after a long surgery, not relief, not victory, just the absence of the weight that had been there before. Something had been removed. The space it left behind was not comfortable yet, but it was clean. Several weeks later, Jonathan called on a Tuesday afternoon. He said federal investigators had executed a search at the Back Bay penthouse. He said Bradley had been home. He said Monica had been there as well. He gave me no further details because I had not asked for them, and he knew I wouldn't. Knew. I sat with that for a moment. Then I went back to the papers on my desk. At 3:47, my phone rang. Monica. I looked at the screen for 2 full seconds before I picked up. I don't know entirely why I picked up, perhaps because I had known her for 11 years, because she had sat at my table at Thanksgiving for 11 years, because she had once, in the first year she and Bradley were married, brought me soup when I had the flu and Bradley was traveling. People are not only one thing. I have always known that, even when I wished it weren't true. I picked up. I heard her voice, and it was different from the voice she had used on Saturday night in the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. That voice had been cold and deliberate and precise. This voice was none of those things. I thought, for a moment, about the winter of 2016. Bradley had been traveling for a conference in Chicago, and I had come down with the flu, the real kind, not the 24-hour variety, the kind that keeps you horizontal for 4 days. Monica had driven over on a Tuesday afternoon without being asked. She had brought soup from the deli on Newbury Street and set it on the kitchen counter and then sat at the table for 20 minutes while I ate it. She hadn't talked about the company. She hadn't talked about Bradley's travel schedule or the new logistics contract or anything that had to do with work. She had asked me about Diane, not about the estate, not about the will, not about what Diane had built alongside me, about Diane, what she had been like when she was young, whether she had always been that direct, or whether that was something that came with time. I had told her about the yellow legal pad. I had told her about the first contract. Monica had listened the way people listen when they are genuinely trying to understand something rather than waiting for their turn to speak. When she left, she had said, "She sounds like someone I would have liked very much." I had believed her. I thought about that afternoon now. I thought about the distance between who Monica had been in that kitchen and who she had been in the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton. And I thought about how a person travels that distance not all at once, not in a single decision, but in small accommodations, one after another, each one easier than the last because the previous one has already been made. I did not think this excused anything. I did not think it changed the outcome, but I thought about it. She said my name once. I listened for 4 seconds. Then I hung up. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the silence did not say better. I set the phone down and did not pick it up again for an hour. Harper called at 6. The number was unfamiliar, a 617 area code I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Then I thought of her face at the rehearsal dinner, the way she had laughed at something her college roommate said, the way she had looked across the room and found me and waved with both hands the way she used to when she was 4 years old. I answered. She was crying before she finished saying my name. She said, "Grandpa, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Her voice broke on the last word. I believed her. That is the part I have thought about most in the weeks since not what Bradley did. Not the $3.7 million. Not the forged signatures, or the 14 transactions, or the 8 months of careful, systematic theft. The hardest part was sitting with the knowledge that Harper had been used as the mechanism for all of it and had not known. That Bradley had arranged his own daughter's wedding as the backdrop for a financial maneuver and had not told her. That the most important day of her young life had been, for her father, a distraction. I let her cry for a moment. Then I said, "I know, Harper. When you're ready, we'll talk." She asked if I was angry at her. I told her I was not. She asked if I would still be her grandfather. I told her that was not a question she ever needed to ask me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Grandpa, where were the pearls?" Her voice was different when she asked it smaller, the way her voice used to get when she was a child, and she understood that something had happened that she hadn't been told about. "Mom said you weren't coming. I thought you just weren't coming." I told her I had been there. I told her I had the pearls with me. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I want to see you." I told her she knew where I lived. She cried a little more. Then she said goodbye. I sat in the chair by the window for a long time after we hung up, looking at the frost on the stone wall. 3 weeks after that, Jonathan sent me a 4-page summary of the federal findings. I read it once, carefully, at my desk on a Tuesday morning. 14 transactions, 8 months, $3.7 million moved through 3 shell accounts that Bradley had opened under subsidiary names I had never authorized. The FBI agent leading the case, a woman named Supervisory Special Agent Carla Reyes, whose name appeared on the cover page, had described it in the summary as a methodical and sustained pattern of financial fraud. Jonathan had underlined that phrase. I don't know if he meant to or if it was a habit. I folded the document along its original crease and put it in the drawer beside Diane's pearls. I did not read it again. Bradley was formally indicted 6 days after the summary arrived. His attorney, not Jonathan, a criminal defense lawyer from a firm I didn't recognize, issued a statement that said Bradley intended to cooperate fully with the investigation. I read that statement once in the newspaper and did not think about it again. Monica filed for divorce 8 days after the FBI came to the penthouse. I learned this from Jonathan, not from her. I did not call her. There was nothing in that decision that required my involvement. 6 weeks after the wedding, Thomas Reeves called me on a Thursday afternoon. Thomas had been a business partner for 14 years. He ran a logistics operation out of Worcester that had been one of Mitchell Global's oldest vendor relationships. He had been at the Ritz-Carlton that Saturday night. He had been standing near the lobby entrance when Bradley stopped me at the ballroom door, and I had seen him turn away. I had noticed it the way you notice everything when your attention sharpens in a crisis clearly and without judgment, filed away for later. He called and said, "Richard, I want to apologize for Saturday night. I should have said something. I didn't. And I've been thinking about it since." His voice was careful, the way a man's voice gets when he has been rehearsing something for weeks. Then he said, "I also want you to know Bradley called me 2 weeks ago. He asked if I had any openings at Northeastern Shipping or if I could put in a word at any of the regional firms I work with." Thomas paused. "I told him I wasn't in a position to do that. I thought you should know he was making those calls." I said, "Thomas, you don't owe me an apology." I meant it. He had been in an impossible position, a business partner watching a family matter unfold in a hotel lobby, with no information and no standing. There was nothing he could have said that would have changed what happened. The evening had already been decided before he arrived, and what he had just told me about Bradley's call, that was its own kind of answer. A man who had spent 8 months moving $3.7 million through shell accounts was now asking former associates for job referrals. The distance between those two things was the whole story. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, thank you." We talked for another 20 minutes about a contract renewal he was considering, a 3-year extension on the freight arrangement that had been running since 2009. We discussed terms. We agreed to meet the following week. It was the most ordinary business conversation I had had in months, and I was grateful for it in a way I didn't expect. In February, on a Tuesday, when the weather had turned clear and cold, I drove to Worcester alone. Martin offered to come. I told him I was fine and that I wouldn't be long. I took Route 9 the way I always used to, before I had a driver, before the company had grown large enough that my time in the car was supposed to be spent on calls. The textile mill on Grafton Street, the one where I had negotiated my first supply contract in March of 1984, a handshake deal with a foreman named Sal Benedetti, who wore the same brown jacket every time I saw him, had been gone for years. I knew that. The building was there, but it had been a coin-operated laundry for at least a decade. I had driven past it once in 2011 and noted it without stopping. I stopped this time. I parked across the street and turned off the engine and looked at it for 3 minutes. The sign above the door was yellow plastic, lit from inside. There were 2 women folding clothes at a table near the window. A child was sitting on a bench near the dryers, looking at something in his hands. There was nothing remarkable about any of it. The building was the building. The street was the street. Sal Benedetti had been dead since 2003. The handshake that had started everything was 40 years gone, and the 40 years between that handshake and this February morning were entirely mine, the hard ones and the good ones, and the ones I would not choose again if I could. I sat there for 3 minutes. Then I started the car and drove home. I did not feel healed. I did not feel finished. I felt like a man who had looked at the beginning of something and understood, for the first time in a long while, that the beginning was real, that it had happened, that it had been enough to build on, and that what had been built was still standing even after everything that had tried to bring it down. The pearls were still in the drawer. The document was folded beside them. I drove home on Route 9, the same road I had driven for 40 years, and I did not think about Bradley, or Monica, or the ballroom, or the 200 people who had watched me walk out of a party I had paid for. I thought about Diane. I thought about the stone wall. I thought about a 12-year-old boy carrying rocks he could barely lift, wanting to help, trying so hard to be useful. I thought that boy was real too. I drove the rest of the way in silence. If you've ever stood at the beginning of something you built with your own hands and realized that no one, not a son who forgot, not a room full of witnesses, not 40 years of quiet could ever take the foundation from you, then you already know exactly what that drive home felt like. If stories like this one find you when you need them most, subscribe. There are more waiting for you here.